Good morning, everybody.
Morning, Rabbi.
Morning, Rabbi.
Okay, so why don't we get started? On Friday, we had left off with a discussion of the mitzvah of Tochacha, and I had briefly gone over the Gemara in Maseches Erechin Daf Tes Zayin, which talks about the difficulty in giving Tochacha, because the Torah says in the same breath that it says, "You shall surely reproach or rebuke your friend," it says in the very same breath in that same pasuk, "V'lo sisa alav chet," but you shall not bear a sin in the process. And so that means that if in any way you cause that person onah, you cause that person pain in the course of trying to reproach them, so you've actually done more harm than good. And so that was where we had two statements. One was from Rabbi Tarfon, and the other one was from Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Two names that are appear at our Seder table, by the way. These are two out of the five that were reclining in Bnei Brak. So Amar Rabbi Tarfon, Tama ani im yesh bador hazeh shemekabel tochacha. He says, I would be surprised if even one person in our generation knows how to properly receive criticism, receive tochacha. Because im amar lo tul kisa mi bein shinecha, amar lo tul kora mi bein einecha. Because as soon as someone is criticized, they become immediately defensive, and they throw it back in the rebuker's face, and they say, who are you to tell me to remove the splinter from between my teeth? Remove the beam between your eyes. Okay, in other words, what you do is much worse. Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, Timihani im yesh bador hazeh sheyodea lahochiach. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, I'd be surprised if there's anyone in this generation who knows how to rebuke or to criticize properly, because it's a very, very delicate art that must be approached very, very delicately. Okay, so the Chazon Ish, in the laws of Shechita, of all places, this appears in I think 2 or 3 places in the Chazon Ish's commentary to Shulchan Aruch and to the Rambam. The Siman Yoredeya Siman Beis is the laws of Shechita, and in the very beginning of the laws of Shechita, the Shulchan Aruch details, based on the Gemara in Chulin, who is qualified to do Shechita. And it starts off by saying that a non-Jew is not qualified to do Shechita. A non-Jew who shechts, the Shechita is invalid, and the animal is not kosher. What happens if a non-observant Jew does the Shechita? Is the Shechita valid or not? So there the Gemara says that it depends. Why is he not observant? There's 2 types of mumar, non-observant Jews. One type of mumar is mumar l'tei avon, and the other one is called mumar lahachis. A mumar l'tei avon is a person who is not observant of the mitzvahs just simply because he doesn't have the backbone to commit himself to a life of observance. He loves cheeseburgers too much. I just had a guy, I was just speaking to a fellow on Thursday, and we had spoken about his lapsing from Judaism. He grew up in a religious home, and he sort of has drifted away. And he said, Rabbi, what can I tell you? I still love butter on my steak. Those are exactly his words. So that is a classic example of a mumar l'tei avon. In other words, he's not doing, I still believe in God, he says, I still believe in all the precepts of the Torah, but I still love butter on my steak. What can I do? That's a mumar l'tei avon, right? A mumar lahachis says, I don't believe any of this stuff. It's all nonsense, and stop trying to make me into a religious Jew. It's all baloney, and that's a mumar lahachis. That's a mumar who does it to not because he can't eat kosher, but he simply refuses to eat kosher because he feels it's all baloney. He feels it's all just nonsense. That's mumar lahachis. And the Shulchan Aruch writes, whereas in certain limited conditions, a mumar l'te'avon's shchita may be kosher, but a mumar lahachis's shchita is surely invalid. It's no different from the shchita of a non-Jew. And of course, this raises a number of questions of how we relate this to the modern Jew, who's either a Reformed Jew or not part of Jewish community at all. So the Chazon Ish just says, "B'chelek Aleph Even Ha'ezer Nashim Simin Kuf Yed Ches, Kasavnu L'das Hagaonim De'ein Mumar Zokek Liyibum." So in a different section of my commentary in Even Ha'ezer, says the Chazon Ish, I already have discussed this concept of Yibum, and when does a brother-in-law not fall to Yibum? If he is a Mumar, if he is this non-observant Jew. But kol oso shedino kimin le'inyan shchita eno zokek liyibum. And that is to say, though, in other words, I created a correlation that if his shchita is invalid, then he doesn't fall for yibum. But if his shchita is valid because he's a mumar l'te'avon and not a mumar lahachis, so then he would fall to yibum. V'kasavnu sham de mumar l'davar echad lahachis o kofer b'torah sheba'al peh b'chlal zeh. And I pointed out at that point, says the Chazon Ish, that if a person is a mumar even for one mitzvah, but he believes it's baloney, just one mitzvah, he believes in the other mitzvahs, but even one mitzvah he feels is nonsense, or he denies Torah sheba'al peh, but he accepts Torah shebichtav, that is included in a mumar lahachis, and therefore his shchita is invalid. Avol l'mashen isbar le'el, ein mumar lahachis l'davar echad bichlal zeh, rak berodef achar ha'isur l'das hara'ah. He says, however, based on my previous commentary in this chapter, I mean, we're jumping in the middle of a longer discussion. He says that if a person believes in the entire Torah except for one mitzvah, so then according to one of the Rishonim, the Ra'ah, then this person would not be considered to be a mumar lahachis unless he actively pursues performing that isser in order to demonstrate that it's nonsense. V'chein kofer b'torsha ba'al peh dafka b'kofer gam be'ikar ol hamitzvos. He says, and furthermore, if a person believes the Torah was written by God, but he rejects all of rabbinic tradition, he is only considered to be a mumar lahachis if he denies his obligation to fulfill the mitzvot. Va'od yesh bazet tanai shelo yihiyeh onus. And let me also point out, and this is really the relevant part of our discussion, is that when do we say that a person is a mumar and therefore his shchita is invalid and does not fall for yibum? That's only when he is not doing what he does out of coercion. And what do we mean by coercion? L'chemoshe kosef harambam perak gimel mehilchos mamrim halacha gimel de b'neihem v'talmideihem chashivi ka'anusim uchatinok shenishma. He says the children of the person who is a mumar, which means a mumar is a person who was educated. He was raised to know, to learn Torah. He was raised by his parents in a religious home. And the Rambam then writes that the children of a mumar, even though they harbor the same invalid beliefs of their father, and they also reject the Torah, they reject rabbinic tradition, and they reject the obligation to do mitzvahs, nonetheless, they are called anusim. They are a victim of circumstance because they were raised in such an environment, and therefore they are not considered to be a mumar lahachis. They are merely considered perhaps to be a mumar l'te'avon, or perhaps even less than a mumar l'te'avon, because they simply are unaware of the realities of Torah. V'tinok shenishba mevi karban kid amar reish perek klal gadol. And after all, a tinok shenishba, a child, that term you're probably familiar with, it means a child that was kidnapped when it was just a babe and was never brought up in a religious environment. So once that child discovers Judaism and is brought into the fold, he brings a korban to atone for his previous non-observance, but it's not. He is not at all considered to have done what he did b'mezid with any level of intentionality, to the point where he brings a korban for his past misdeeds. A mummer does not bring a korban for his past misdeeds. If a person says, I know that eating steak with butter is usser, but I just really like it, so that's called mazid. That's called doing the isser intentionally. But here, the tinok shenishba is even less than a mummer l'te'avon. He is so innocent because he never knew that such a thing was prohibited. Umitzuvin anu lahachioso, va'af lechalal alav hashabes b'shvil hatzalasa. And therefore, we are obligated to support such a Jew. What does it mean to support such a Jew? When we give out tzedakah to the community, we have to give out tzedakah to the tinok shenishva. I have a bit of a bone to pick with those communities where the Tomchei Shabbos only supports people who are Shomer Shabbos. I understand that they have to triage community resources, but according to what the Chazon Ish writes, if such a person who is not observant but doesn't do it out of malice, but rather because they were raised in let's say the former Soviet Union, and so they have no connection to Yiddishkeit other than what they learned from their parents, and that's the reason why they're not Shomer Shabbos, then why shouldn't we give them food for Shabbos just like we give food for Shabbos to anybody else? Aren't they also entitled? It says over here, we have to support them, and we have to be Machal Shabbos in order to save them if their lives are in danger. Uvahagos maimini perak vav mehilchos deos kasav de'ein rishayin l'sanoso ela achar she'eno mekabel tochacha. So, and furthermore, the Hagos Maimini, which is a very old commentary on the Rambam, writes that you have no right to bear any malice towards such a person, unless you attempted to rebuke him and he didn't accept your rebuke. And then when you try to educate him and he rejects you, he rebuts you, so then you're allowed to bear malice towards him. But then he goes even further, and he writes, "Uvesof sefer avas chesed, kosav b'shem hagri mulin, de mitzvah le'ehov es harishayim mehai taima." He says there is a concept of loving the wicked. What does it mean to love the wicked? There's a mitzvah to love people who are not observing mitzvahs. And the reason is because the people who are not observing mitzvahs, by and large, are anusim. They don't know what they're doing. Vehevi kain mitshuvas maharam lublin, ki atzleinu hu kodem tochacha she'eino yodim lahalchiach. And the reason is because what did the Hagos Maimoni write? He said that if you go over to someone who's not observing the Torah, and you give him tochacha, and you rebuke him, and he still refuses to heed your words, and he continues his non-observance, so then you're permitted to hate him, because just like you're permitted to hate any wicked person. However, the Maram Lublin writes that that's no longer true, because since the Gemara had said that we don't know how to rebuke today, like Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, even in his generation, people didn't know how to rebuke properly. So since we don't know how to rebuke, then everyone in our purview who is not observing the Torah is like a person who has never been rebuked in their life, because no one knows how to properly rebuke, and therefore you have a mitzvah to love them. You cannot hate them. They are like any other Jew who's observing the Torah. V'daininan lahu ka'anusim, and we judge them as a person who is committing the sins against their will. V'lachein efshar lanu ladun bazel liftar min hayibum b'chem le'inyan shar halachas. And therefore, let's say for the mitzvah of Yibum, you cannot say that just because the brother of the deceased is not a Torah observant Jew, then the woman is off the hook from the mitzvah of Yibum. She's going to still have to get chalitza from a non-observant brother-in-law, because he's a tinok shenishba. He's like an anus. He doesn't have the proper education to know how to observe the Torah. So of course, when you see something like this that's written by the Chazon Ish in the early part of the 20th century, this gives rise to the Kiruv movement in the latter part of the 20th century. Because once this attitude pervades the world, then it becomes clear that we cannot simply abandon our Jewish brethren based on the fact that, if someone's not observant, they're no longer part of our people. Just the opposite is true from what the Chazon Ish writes. We don't know how to rebuke today. And since we don't know how to rebuke today, we're off the hook from even giving the rebuke in the way that is described in the Halacha Sfarim before, that you have to go over to him and tell him what he's doing is wrong. And if he doesn't listen to you, you have to go back to him and you have to keep rebuking him until what? Until he starts to curse you or is about to strike you. Okay? So none of that applies when we look at the Chazon Ish. He says, we don't know how to rebuke. So you see your neighbor is who says good Shabbos to you and then gets in his car. And I'm surrounded by those people on my block, and they're wonderful people. They're just lovely, lovely people. There's one of my neighbors is a member of our shul, but is not Shomer Shabbos. And you have a few of those that are members of the shul simply, and they come for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur because they like the traditional davening, but they're simply not observant. And so there's a mitzvah to love them, and there's a mitzvah to take care of them, just like you would take care of any frum Jew. And that's the reason why, when we looked at our halacha in the Imrei Yaakov, I said don't do anything. And even when we looked at the Mishnah Berurah, which is again the difference between just a few decades between the Chafetz Chaim and the Chazon Ish, also you see a tremendous shift in attitude in the way that we approach this halacha of tochacha. Questions, comments?
Yeah, Rabbi, just getting back to the example I gave last week about a relative who was posting on Facebook this idea about where they were showing, if you recall, I said, like they showed a picture of a squid and they showed a picture of the squid on the barbecue type of thing. So now what they're doing is they're sort of more publicly proclaiming the Avera here, as opposed to keeping it more private. So isn't there an obligation for me, who knows this person very well or something like that, to have to, even though they are aware, this person is aware, and they understand that this is not a non-kosher product, everything like that. We're brought up in a traditional household, but not necessarily like a shomer mitzvah type of household.
Yeah, right. So this person, if they were not brought into a strictly observant home, fall under the category of what the Chazon Ish has just described. And it shouldn't really make a difference whether they're publicly or privately flouting the mitzvahs and not observing Judaism. It's to them, there's nothing wrong with this. Come on, we're living in the 21st century now. What difference does it make between eating a squid and eating a fish? They're both seafood. And who really does this stuff? This stuff is ridiculous. Come on, the Bible was written in a time when we didn't know a lot of things scientifically, yada, yada, yada. And therefore, what's the big deal? Come on, Ron, cousin Ron, leave me alone. And what are you really going to accomplish? So, no, you don't have an obligation. You have to assess the situation. You have to, if you see that someone is not observing the mitzvahs, someone that you are close with, someone that's a member of your family, so then the first thing is to step back and say, what is this based on? Why is this person doing that? What happened to them? Look, do you know? I'll have you know that on Facebook today, there's a young man. His father and I were in Kollel together. His father's a rabbi. We came up the ranks together, and his father now is a sofer and sells Judaica. And his son spent years in Kollel. And after having spent years in Kollel, the son came to the realization that he's an atheist. And he now has a Facebook group, something like OTD something. It's OTD something. It's off the derech, stands for off the derech. For a few years, he had hidden his identity, and did not want people to know that he was no longer religious. But once he became more in his personal life, he and his wife decided that they were no longer going to be Orthodox. After having spent years in Kollel, now I just want to make sure you understand what I'm saying. Years in Kollel, like go over to Rabbi Shiner's Kollel and look at any one of those young men. He fit into that world more than you or I do. And he decided that he no longer, he's a very, very smart young man, sometimes a little bit too smart, right? He's a very, very intelligent young man, studied a lot of philosophy, came to the realization that there's no God, and that all of that we do really has no meaning other than perhaps cultural. And so he decided that this is no longer for him. He felt too constrained, too constricted, whatever it is. And that was that for him. Okay. So the question is, what should be the approach? I'm Facebook friends with this young man. He used to come to my house and play with my son. They were best friends when they were growing up. Now, what is the proper approach to this young man? At this point, I can't say that I have a relationship with him. I just remember him as a boy growing up. So I watch his posts and I try to learn from them. I try to understand what is the zeitgeist, what is the pervasive attitude that's running through the minds of these young people today who are sadly leaving Yiddishkeit, tragically leaving Yiddishkeit. Whereas Ron, you and all of your contemporaries, you did a 180 in your life and became Balei Tshuva. So the next generation or the next two generations are kids who are brought up by the Balei Tshuva, and they're checking out. A lot of them. I mean, some of them are wonderful. Some of them are very, very committed, more so than their parents. But a lot of them have decided to check out. So what do we do with such kids? They went to yeshiva. They got a great education. But I'm going to go out on a limb and go even further than the Chazon Ish. Today, we live in such a confusing world where there's a constant bombardment, even to children who are raised in Orthodox homes, a constant bombardment of ideologies that are antithetical to our tradition and are specifically addressed at pulling people away from religious values and traditional beliefs, and basically say that all of religion in general is anachronistic, is not keeping with modernity, is primitive, and is only their religion in general is only a way of trying to make sense of a mysterious world. But now that science has made sense of the mysteries of the world, we no longer need religion. Right? Religion was only put into society because man looked up at the sky and had so many questions about how the universe runs. He came up with an answer that there must be a God who runs all of this. But today, science can write God out of the equation. There's no need for a creator or for different intelligences that move the world. And there are some very, very sophisticated, convincing arguments for atheism, for agnosticism. So even children who spent years and years studying, the curriculum in our yeshivas today and in our seminaries today is simply inadequate to and lacks the intellectual rigor to be able to withstand those kinds of attacks. And therefore, for the children of the people who gave up so much to live a life of orthodoxy, I would even go beyond what the Chazon Ish wrote in the 1940s and the 50s and say that in 100 years or close to 100 years later, we have to realize that things have gotten even worse, and that even children who grew up in religious homes are also anusim. When they leave the faith, they are also have been kidnapped, so to speak, based upon the bombardment from social media and the internet of ideologies that pull them away from the Torah. And so, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to ostracize such a young man. This young man he professes, like this young fellow that I was just referring to a moment ago. He's not interested in converting Orthodox Jews to non-Orthodox Jews. He is there to provide support, however, to people like himself who have decided to check out. And so they have a discussion group, and they talk about their experiences, and they talk about how they get along with family members who are still part of the Frum community, and how they maneuver, and how they respect each other, and how they manage, the difficult situations around the holidays and things like that. And they talk about, when you were Frum, what were some of the things that you felt that, that could have been better, that perhaps you would have stayed if this had happened, or this hadn't happened. Look, unfortunately, our educational system and the way that we expose our children to Judaism is not perfect. And the expectation that we have that if we raise them in a Frum environment, they will take to it automatically without any kind of ideological training, without explaining to them why we do the things that we do, does not hold as strongly as it did in previous generations. We have to accept that. We have to be aware of it, and we have to try and do our best to use wisdom in raising our children. And when children do leave the fold, we have to hold on to them, and we have to make sure that nothing will shake the bond in the relationship, even though the way that we observe Judaism is different. And even though we may be profoundly disappointed, or look through, when we see our children, we see the failures of our own, because what did I do wrong? I thought I gave my child all of the things that I found to be so beautiful, that I was willing to sacrifice so much in order to adhere to this lifestyle. And what did I do wrong that it didn't pass on to them? Yeah, and all of that disappointment and all of that angst and so forth, we have to put that aside, lock it in a box, and just remember there are children. We have to do whatever we can to love them. All right, so that's enough.
Rabbi,
Yes.
can I ask a loaded question? How do you balance holding on to that child with it not having a negative effect with your other children?
It's a constant struggle, and you have to figure it out. Every case is unique, right? Obviously, if the child is disruptive at the Shabbos table and they refuse to participate because they're angry and they're bitter and things like that, that's one scenario, and that has to be dealt with in one way. But if a child wants to stay in their room the whole Shabbos and they're not interested in coming down for Shabbos, and they want to instead be on their computer, but they respect everyone else in the family, so they'll come down for Kiddush and they'll listen to Hamotzi, and they'll engage with the family, and then they'll go and do their own thing in their private room. That's a different situation. Every family dynamic is unique, and we have it. It's a constant issue. It's something that I have to deal with on a semi-regular basis, and every family situation is unique. But the biggest mistake that a parent can make is getting angry at the child. It's a big, big mistake, because it's not going to help. It's going to do the opposite of helping. Okay, we'll hold it here for today. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Rabbi.